Okay, we are here today with Professor Karina Nielsen from the University of East Anglia that has just presented a keynote lecture on the role that line managers can have in making or breaking organizational intervention. How did you become interested on this topic?
Well, I did my PhD at the University of Nottingham a few years ago, and it was a very strong institute in that it did an awful lot of intervention research, and it was quite novel in two ways. First, because it had adapted the way of doing interventions from Scandinavia, and I came from Denmark, so it was kind of familiar to me, but also because they did something that was quite extraordinary at the time, and to some extent still is, that they were, rather than just focusing on the effects of interventions, they were looking at what are the processes and the contextual factors that influence intervention outcomes. So it's not just looking at the effects of interventions in terms of the content that we plan or the organizations plan, but also the side effects or whatever you can call it, all the bits that we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to normally, how these kind of things also influence our intervention effects. And doing that kind of work, and I kind of realized, well, line managers, there's a lot of research in line managers, but it's not often used in organizational interventions. But when I talk to colleagues that do organizational interventions, we often hear that line managers make or break an intervention. So what I'm interested in is trying to make that explicit. So even if we've got the awareness, we don't necessarily know what to do about it, and we are not explicitly evaluating it. So that was kind of the point I was trying to make today, is that we need to be looking at line managers in particular and explicitly when we do our interventions.
And in your lecture, you mentioned the opportunity or the usefulness of both collecting data in order to check the effects, but also to have qualitative also data collection, which is the added contribution that these aspects can introduce.
Yeah, I think we can, for the effect evaluation, I do think we need quantitative before and after, and preferably with a control group, so we can see how it compares to business as usual or care as usual. But in terms of the processes, I think we need to consider carefully how we collect data, and I think you can do that both quantitatively but also qualitatively. And I think where the field should be going next is to try to find out how do we get the right kind of contextual processual information. So, for example, there are some things that you can gather with quantitative data, process evaluation data, like, for example, I just mentioned whether line managers communicated with their employees, whether they involve their employees in the development of the intervention, whether they took the lead in making things happen, these kind of things. If we do that quantitatively, we can statistically link it to our outcomes and examine whether they're mediators or moderators. What we can't do with a quantitative process evaluation is something we could do with a qualitative process evaluation. We can go behind the activities and the actions of line managers and understand why they chose to do or not do things, and why they chose to do them in the way they did.
And how do you do this, that you go behind and try to check how do they understand?
That's a good question. What we have done is we've published a paper in 2013 in the European Journal of Work and Organizational Psychology, where we have developed a framework for what you should be looking at when you process evaluate, and we have formulated a range of questions that you can use to highlight what's going on. So I would primarily say use it do interviews, and there you can ask line managers for their mental models of the intervention and the reasons for their specific behaviors. But it's also important that you ask the employees, because the line managers might give you what they think you need to hear or you want to hear, and employees kind of give you the raw version, how they perceive things. So I think it's important to interview both line managers to get understanding of how they see things, but also interview employees to find out how do they perceive the line managers' behaviors and how those line managers' behaviors have influenced their behaviors as well. Because of course organizational interventions is all about them changing the working practices as well.
You presented many very interesting studies. There has been some interesting result or interesting find that you would like to report that you observed in recently?
The most interesting finding. I think that's the thing about organizational interventions. I think all findings are interesting when you move beyond the mere is there an effect or not, to understand how and why and in which circumstances we see an effect. So in that respect, I have to say I don't have a favorite study as such, and there's no finding that surprised me the most. I think the most surprising thing perhaps is that you can always learn from interventions, even if they on paper are failed because they didn't bring about the desired or intended effects. You can always learn why that happened. And then you can develop theories for what are the conditions that are necessary for us to develop and implement successful interventions.
Which are the implications of your findings for practitioners working in organizational change?
Yeah, I think today what I had brought with me were only studies that organizations themselves had developed. So we actually didn't develop the interventions as researchers. We just evaluated and monitored, followed what they were doing. So I think this has huge implications for practitioners, because what you could say we were doing was that we were evaluating how practitioners actually do this. And I think what the implications are for practitioners is that they could probably learn something from research, because when we do organizational interventions in research, we spend a lot of time setting up the intervention, making sure that the right people are involved, working with people's mindsets. We do a lot to risk assess or to screen what are the existing problems, what are the challenges. And I think across the studies that I included in my presentation today was that these two first stages perhaps hadn't been done particularly well. So, for example, the HR department in the accountancy I was talking about had an idea that this was a problem when they held exit interviews with people who left. These problems were highlighted. People that went on sick leave highlighted these things, but they didn't actually do a very thorough risk assessment or screening of what the problems were. And they didn't do a needs assessment either of, well, we have these expectations and line managers are going to go with these guidelines that we give them and they're going to implement it. But they didn't actually make sure, they didn't assess whether line managers were prepared to do this or they had the resources, the competencies to do it. So I think it's probably doing the pre-steps of developing guidelines, making sure that when you develop guidelines, there's an opportunity that line managers actually can implement those guidelines.
You mentioned the importance of taking into account the process and the context. What do you mean with this?
The process, I mainly mean the process of the intervention. So going through the different steps. In organizational intervention research is quite often there's an initiation phase that then move on to a screening, risk assessment phase, where you then develop action plans on the basis on results of your screening risk assessment, and then you implement and then you evaluate. And I think for each of those steps, we need to be looking at what happens in each step. For example, if we take risk assessment screening as a very concrete example, what kind of screening do you do? Do you do interviews or do you do a questionnaire? Is the questionnaire actually detailed enough to capture the problems in the organization? If it's not, that's going to have implications for the action plans that are being developed. Because if you don't really know what the problem is, you can't develop good action plans. So that's why I think we need to be understanding these things. Because if we don't understand that, we don't understand why it didn't have an effect. And if we don't understand the effects, we can't build it into future intervention and say, okay, well, next time we do it, we need to make sure that our questionnaire actually have an opportunity to capture the real problems, the real issues within the organization. With regards to context, what I mean by context is both what I call omnibus context and discrete context. And the omnibus context is like, you could call the culture, the stable characteristics of the organization. It's also what kind of occupation are you working with. If we take nurses as an example, or healthcare, there are certain demands put on nurses to deal with clients and patients. So when we develop our intervention, we need to be thinking about, okay, these people need to see to their clients. So when we develop our workshops to develop action plans, for example, then we need to develop them in such a way that the nurses have an opportunity to attend these workshops. So we might need to get temping staff in. So that's the kind of thing. In terms of discrete context, I'm thinking about the events that are occurring during the intervention. So for example, downsizing, that's likely to have an impact on how actively people work with the intervention. Also, if there's a new manager coming in, he might think this is a fantastic project, I can use it. It fits in with my mental model of what I want to do with this organization. Or you might find a manager think this is the worst idea in the world and will do everything to stop it. So that's going to have a huge impact on our intervention outcomes, and therefore we need to take that into consideration. And then we can turn around and say, well, of course you can never stop concurring events to happen, but you might want to make sure that the intervention is embedded in such a way that it doesn't depend on one manager for it to be implemented. Yeah.
So, what is your final suggestion or an important recommendation for researchers planning organizational design intervention study?
What I would do, and I do as an intervention researcher, is when I set up my intervention study, I make a model for what is the content of the intervention, what are the things I need to measure to understand whether the intervention has an effect or not, and what are the factors that might be influencing throughout each stage of the intervention. And then you need to decide, okay, so what kind of information do I need, and how am I going to get it? Can I use quantitative process evaluation, or do I need to have interviews with people? Can I get it through meeting minutes? Because of course it's about not collecting more data than you need, and also collecting data that you can analyze. So I think these are the considerations that you need to do as a researcher, or to make as a researcher when you plan your intervention.
Anything else that you would like to add? I can ask you.
No, I think I got to say a lot of the things I would like to say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the intervention, and wish you a nice continuation of the conference.
Thank you. Did you?